timely and necessary today's hearing is. This year will mark the 20th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks, the very tragedy that necessitated the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and this committee. In the days and months following the deadliest terror attack on U.S. soil, Americans of all views came together to unify against the threat of foreign terrorists. Like so many challenges in our nation's history, we emerged stronger than ever. To confront the emerging threats to our homeland today, we can't play politics with national security. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your partnership as we've set out to ensure that this committee remains above the fray and focused on solving problems. Today, we sit here just shy of 20 years after 9/11 to examine the increasingly prevalent and troubling threat from violent extremists, not from some distant land, but from here at home. The threat posed by domestic violent extremists may be new to many of us, but it is not new for our country. In the 1960s and 70s, left-wing extremists known as the Weather Underground carried out dozens of bombings, including one right here inside the U.S. Capitol. In fact, in an 18-month period between 1971 and 1972, extremist groups conducted over 2,500 bombings here in the United States. 3 decades later, an anti-government extremist planned and carried out the deadliest homegrown attack in United States history, killing 168 people with a truck bomb at a federal building in Oklahoma City. The sad reality is that there will always be those who use ideology and politics as an excuse to commit violence. It is our responsibility to see to it that they are not successful. Over the past 12 months, we have seen a marked increase in the activity of domestic violent extremists. In July, amid nationwide protests, extremists in Portland set fire to police stations and attacked a federal courthouse. In December, a man in Nashville detonated a bomb planted in a recreational vehicle, killing himself, injuring 8 others, and disabling a critical telecommunications facility. And just last month, right-wing extremists attacked the United States Capitol. 5 people died on that dark day, including a Capitol police officer who was laid to rest this week. Just like 9/11, we will never forget. We will never forget the assault on the heart of our democracy on January 6th. It was a very difficult thing to watch unfold. While our nation's law enforcement and national security agencies are better prepared to combat emerging threats like domestic extremism than in previous years, much more needs to be done to bolster information sharing among federal, state, and local partners. While investigations are ongoing, I am concerned that our counterterrorism efforts continue to be hindered by bureaucratic silos and failure to share the necessary intelligence and then to act on that intelligence. The Department of Homeland Security is central to our nation's effort to protect against terrorist and extremist violence here at home, and it is imperative that we ensure it is well equipped for that mission. It is also our job here at the Committee on Homeland Security to better understand what motivates these extremists and ultimately how to stop them. Radicalization of all sorts that leads to any violence should be unacceptable across the board. With that in mind, I want to encourage all of my colleagues to rise above partisan politics and work together to examine these issues and find solutions. We must do the job our constituents sent us here to do by being honest about the challenges facing our country from violent extremism, even when it may not be politically expedient to do so. It is our solemn responsibility, especially on this committee, to be sober-minded in our efforts to secure our homeland. That is why I co-sponsored legislation championing Ranking Member Davis on the House Administration Committee to establish a national commission on the domestic terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol, similar to the 9/11 Commission, which helped create the Homeland Security enterprise we have today. This important bipartisan commission would provide Congress with real answers to our questions and solutions to close critical Homeland Security gaps. This legislation, referred to our committee, has the support of every Republican member of the committee, and I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join us and move this bill through Congress. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Members are also reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in our February 3rd colloquy regarding the motion procedure. I welcome our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Christopher Rodriguez, the Director of Washington, D.C.'s Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. Dr. Rodriguez is responsible for emergency planning, preparedness, response, and recovery for the city, including operations at a 24-hour emergency operations center in the district's intelligence fusion center. Our second witness is Ms. Elizabeth Newman, the former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Newman has over 2 decades of experience developing and implementing Homeland Security and national security policies and strategies for multiple federal agencies. Our third witness is Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO and National Director of ADL. Mr. Greenblatt brings extensive experience from the private sector and government. Under Mr. Greenblatt, ADL has worked in new and innovative ways to counter and combat extremism in all forms. Our fourth and final witness is Mr. Brian Michael Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the RAND President. A former military officer, Mr. Jenkins is the author of numerous books, reports, and articles on domestic and international terrorism. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask Dr. Rodriguez to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Paco, members of the committee. I am Dr. Chris Rodriguez, Director of the District of Columbia's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, which I've led since 2017. Prior to this role, I was a counterterrorism analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency for over 10 years. And as an appointee of Mayor Muriel Bowser, I'm honored to lead an agency that is responsible for Washington, D.C.'s preparedness, coordination, management, and recovery from all hazards, from a snowstorm to a hurricane, to a global pandemic, and of course to a terrorist attack such as the one we saw on January 6th. I appear today to discuss the January 6th attack that led to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which, based upon my experience, was clearly an act of domestic terrorism. And this attack exposed in the starkest terms the threat we face from domestic terrorists and from right-wing extremism specifically. Now, various times throughout our history, we have witnessed virulent strains of political ideologies and violent political ideologies that run through the American bloodstream. But time and again, these radical movements have been rooted out or minimized in our system. Well, what should concern us now in 2021 is that the current manifestation of these movements is so insidious, because while in the past they existed on the fringes of society, they are becoming rapidly part of the cultural mainstream. And these movements are fueled and fed by misinformation and lies that, if not addressed, will only continue to exacerbate our underlying social divisions and threatening to tear at the delicate fabric of our democratic culture. Now, as we manage and coordinate public safety agencies to respond to various nefarious acts, the District of Columbia is reimagining safety and security in the face of the evolving threat of domestic terrorism. I want to speak very briefly about the 5 elements of our strategy. First, we must regain the narrative. A byproduct of radical violent movements entering the mainstream is that they distort real and meaningful debate. Right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism are not mainstream viewpoints. QAnon, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, anarchists, and Antifa do not espouse mainstream perspectives, nor should they be treated and validated as such. While the District of Columbia hosts hundreds of First Amendment events per year and respects the rights of all Americans to exercise this constitutional guarantee, even when we disagree with those viewpoints, we will not tolerate violence in our city, and we will call such acts what they are in accordance with the law: crimes and terrorism. In a similar vein, we also know, and we have experienced this here in the district, that our foreign adversaries, Russia in particular, are employing decades-old tools of covert action to fan the flames of cultural conflict here in the US. And our foreign enemies do this by creating or perpetuating false narratives that strike at the heart of democracy itself, that our elections are rigged, that our system is inherently corrupt, and should be overthrown, and that radical voices who call for violence or insurrection have legitimate views that should be heard. In regaining the narrative, we need to call these actions what they are, a direct assault on our system of government. Second, we must demonstrate an overt security presence in DC, at least for now. The District of Columbia, at Mayor Bowser's direction, has requested that 500 DC National Guard personnel remain on standby as a quick reaction force through March 12th. We believe that this posture is essential to ensuring that the Metropolitan Police Department can deploy resources to all parts of the city during an emergency. We also believe that we can achieve security in our city, and specifically on Capitol Hill, without making permanent the current razor wire top fencing and armed troops surrounding the Capitol. As the host of our federal government, the district government plays an important role in the Capitol's long-term security posture. Mayor Bowser has already suggested one common sense proposal, and that is to transfer control of the DC National Guard to the mayor of the District of Columbia, which would allow for swifter operational decisions during an evolving incident. As we saw on January 6th, under federal control, the Guard is not as nimble and responsive as it could be. Third, we must leverage our national intelligence network better. At its core, the value of intelligence is early warning. It gives policymakers such as yourselves decision-making advantage in a world full of strategic threats. We need to utilize a key tool developed after 9/11 in a more systematic way, and that is the state fusion centers. Funded by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, these intelligence hubs need to do better at sharing information across the network, because the domestic terrorist threat is fundamentally one that originates locally and then spreads across state borders. The nearly 80 fusion centers that exist across the nation have more than 2,000 intelligence analysts that are funded by federal dollars, but their intelligence should be more widely disseminated to those who need it. In DC, we seek to build out our fusion centers' analytic capabilities in both the physical and virtual realms, particularly to assist local and federal law enforcement. In the coming months, the Fusion Center will begin to deploy personnel to key federal agencies, but we need more funding and more resources from DHS for this program. Fourth, we must engage our communities and workforces better. A particularly troublesome finding in the early investigations of those who participated in the January 6th insurrection is that a small but disproportionately impactful segment of the mob used military tactics to organize and manage the successful advance into and throughout the Capitol. FBI investigations that have been made public have reported that some of these individuals had U.S. military backgrounds and participated in military-style training camps prior to traveling here to Washington, D.C. All this said, surely there are people in our communities that might know such activities are taking place, either in plain sight in the dark corners of the internet or in casual conversations. We need to prioritize insider threat programs in the U.S. military and law enforcement to ensure that their specific skill sets, which are developed to defend a nation, a state, a community, are not then turned on the very people they are sworn to protect. Finally, we must be prepared for a long fight. Many of the initiatives discussed here will require new law enforcement and legal tools. However, the key element of our success will be ours, yours, and mine, as well as the American people's willingness to persist in the fight. The mental and psychological toll of what happened on January 6th, as all of you and your staffs and our police officers can personally attest, can be overwhelming. And tragically, some of our finest have already taken their lives following the insurrection. Our best chance for success, though, is to be straight with the American people. But the threats we now face are arguably as dangerous as they were in the post-9/11 environment, and these threats are not going away. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I now ask Ms. Newman to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for holding today's hearing. I offer my deepest condolences to Officer Sicknick's family, all of the police officers that were injured, and to you, members of Congress and your staff. While the attack on January 6th was an assault on our democracy and therefore on all Americans, it was an extremely personal experience for each of you. I thank you for your willingness to serve the American people during this dark time, even in the face of threats of violence. I've spent my career immersed in Homeland Security related government reforms needed to address emerging threats and government failures. The security failure of January 6th was not an intelligence failure. Many had warned about the threat of violence. It was rather a failure of poor judgment and insufficient preparation. It was also an act of domestic terrorism. As I explained in my written testimony, the statutory definition is clearly met by the crimes that occurred and the intent of the individuals that stormed the Capitol. Bipartisan agreement upon this designation is paramount to ensuring future security efforts. We must be clear with our words on this matter and stand unified against rhetoric that incites violence to achieve political goals. In my written testimony, I lay out 5 recommendations. For brevity, let me highlight 3 here. I believe we need to establish an independent bipartisan commission to explore the best ways to update our laws, policies, and culture to address domestic terrorism. I believe we need to criminalize domestic terrorism and consider updating other statutes to ensure equal justice is applied. And I believe we need to formally codify the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention to send a strong signal to the community that we are investing in prevention. Since I last appeared before one of the subcommittees of this body, I believe the environment in which we approach domestic terrorism has become exponentially more complicated. A few highlights. First, the global COVID-19 pandemic increased social isolation and other stress factors known to increase radicalization. These stressors expose cracks and amplified grievances held by vulnerable individuals, which led to increased radicalization and some mobilization to violence. As a side note, the term vulnerable individuals is explained more thoroughly in my written testimony, and there's a graphic at the end of my testimony which you can refer to, which outlines these terms. It shows a simplistic framework for the different stages of how an individual radicalizes and mobilizes to violence. This graphic came out of a RAND study that was done for DHS in 2018. Second, the underlying causes behind the January 6th attack also increased the number of vulnerable individuals. So recruitment is easier now for extremist groups than it ever has been before. Extremist ideas have been mainstreamed and normalized through political speech, conspiracy theories, and communications that use humor and memes to mask the danger of those ideas present. Consequently, there is a high likelihood of violence in the coming months on a range of softer targets associated with their perception of the deep state, including infrastructure, mainstream media, law enforcement, big tech, and elected officials. There are many other complicating factors I can't go into at this moment, but sadly, I do believe that we will be fighting domestic terrorism that has its roots and inspiration points from January 6th for the next 10 to 20 years. And for this reason, I believe it is paramount that we establish a shared understanding of this threat and a bipartisan commitment to address it so that discussions about domestic terrorism itself can't be manipulated or misreported, further feeding the grievance cycle into radicalization and mobilization to violence. So let me return to where I started. I urge the Congress to consider establishing a domestic terrorism commission. I urge that at a minimum, we change our laws to ensure equal justice, treating threats from ideologies that originated overseas and within the United States the same. These are very complicated and thorny issues, which is why I believe we need a commission to address them appropriately. Last, I want to urge you to scale the prevention work we began together in the 116th Congress. Thank you for your support during my tenure at DHS and thereafter. Your bipartisan work on expanding prevention capabilities in the United States has prepared us for this moment, but there is still much work that needs to be done. You led a 1,200% increase in funding for prevention over the last 2 fiscal years. In federal budget terms, that's almost unheard of. I would ask you to please consider accelerating these prevention efforts. In particular, I urge you to authorize the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention and help it scale rapidly through additional resources to be able to assist our state and local partners with developing the prevention capabilities we need in our communities to better assist individuals before they mobilize to violence. In closing, we need to recognize that the root causes of this new face of terrorism are not things that the security community can fix. President Obama called it an epistemological crisis. He said, if we do not have the capacity to distinguish what is true from what is false, and by definition, the marketplace of ideas does not work, and by definition, our democracy does not work. Today's hearing is an opportunity for each of us to demonstrate we can disagree without becoming disagreeable. And I believe there is much upon which we can agree. Confronting this threat will require calling on other parts of our society to defeat domestic terrorism. The challenge ahead requires rediscovering we are Americans before we are a party affiliation or a political philosophy. It requires rebuilding civic society at a local level, choosing respectful civil discourse over cancel culture, and rejecting political ideologies or identity politics that focus on grouping them into an enemy of the tribe. We'll begin here today, but each of us has a role as we leave in our homes and in our local communities, because the greatest disruption to the grievance cycle that leads to violence begins by loving our neighbor as we'd like to be loved ourselves. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I now ask Mr. Greenblatt to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Catco, and all the members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Jonathan Greenblatt. I'm the CEO of ADL, and it's an honor to talk with you about the urgent threat posed by domestic terrorism. As many of you know, ADL is the oldest anti-hate group in the world and one of the longest-standing civil rights organizations in the United States. For more than a century, ADL has worked to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. As part of our work, we built a world-class team investigating extremist threats, an evil that has intensified and expanded with devastating consequences. Indeed, we should keep in mind, extremism is not new. It has evolved and mutated over the decades. In the 1960s, what we could describe as left-wing terrorism was a serious threat. But in recent decades, and in particular over the past 5 years, right-wing extremism, and in particular, white supremacy, has experienced a terrifying resurgence. Let me make clear, this is not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. It is an American problem, and I'm heartened to see this committee coming together to tackle it. Why is the threat of right-wing extremism on the rise? I believe there are two forces that are fueling this movement. First, leaders at the highest levels who have repeated their rhetoric, co-opted their conspiracies, and whether intentional or not, given extremists the green light. The second is social media. No longer does a person have to decamp to a clandestine compound in the woods. Today, you can find hate 24/7 with just a few clicks on your phone. And as we know, online hate can explode into real-world violence. We saw this in 2015 at a Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, in 2018 at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 2019 at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. Indeed, white supremacists are responsible for more murders than any other type of domestic extremist, accounting for nearly 60% of all such crimes in the past decade. ADL just released yesterday our annual report on murder and extremism. We found that extremist activity skyrocketed in 2020. 16 out of 17 of the deaths were caused by right-wing extremists, and there were more than 5,000 incidents of white supremacist propaganda in the country last year, almost double the number in 2019. And frighteningly, as we saw on January the 6th, more and more ordinary people are being radicalized and spurred to acts of terror, weaponized against this very Congress and the Republic itself. For decades, ADL's Center on Extremism has been actively monitoring hate groups of all stripes. And in recent months, we've tracked domestic extremists lashing out at elected officials in the wake of last November's election. Indeed, what happened at the US Capitol was the most predictable terror attack in American history. That act of domestic terrorism was a watershed moment for the white supremacist movement in this country. For them, the sight of congressmen and women cowering under tables, Confederate flags, and Nazi symbols being paraded through the building was nothing short of a victory. And at ADL, while we were shocked by the violence, we weren't surprised. This insurrection material is out of thin air, and it will not dissipate in its aftermath unless we take action, but a whole of society strategy to combat white supremacy and all forms of domestic terrorism. With that in mind, ADL respectfully presents to you today the Bipartisan Protect Framework, a comprehensive 7-part plan to mitigate the threat posed by right-wing extremism and domestic terrorism while staying true to American freedoms and values. The details are in my written testimony, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but the highlights include, number 1, passing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. Number 2, coordinating across all government agencies, federal, state, and local, with a clear prioritization of the problem. Number 3, ensuring that extremists cannot serve in the military, in law enforcement, or in elected office. Number 4, holding social media companies accountable for their complicity in facilitating extremism. Number 5, funding creative efforts to prevent people from radicalizing and off-ramping individuals caught up in these conspiracies. And number 6, targeting foreign white supremacist terror groups. Because make no mistake, this movement is a global threat. And here's what you need to keep in mind, and what I think makes our plan different than some of the others. There is no silver bullet to stopping the threat of domestic terrorism. A singular statute won't solve the problem. This is a multi-pronged approach to address a multi-pronged issue. It acknowledges the existing authorities that are already available, even as we innovate with new approaches. Members of the committee, we can accomplish our goals while protecting vulnerable communities. And together, these actions should have a significant impact on preventing and countering domestic extremism and protecting the homeland. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I now ask Mr. Jenkins to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, members of the committee, for inviting me to again testify. We've come through a difficult year that has witnessed anguish, anger, and turmoil in our cities, which violent anarchists and others have exploited to advance their own agendas. And we have recently seen the resurgence of threats from the far right, as the previous members of the panel have pointed out, culminating in the events of January 6th. I want to focus on that event and its potential consequences. But first, I too want to acknowledge the Capitol police officer killed during the attack, the 2 police officers who ended their lives shortly after, and many brave officers who were injured defending the Capitol. A violent mob invaded the very symbol of our republic during a constitutionally mandated procedure necessary for the peaceful transfer of power, the very essence of our democracy. This unprecedented assault on America's political system will have long-term consequences, including the likelihood of further violence throughout the country as the most determined elements of the movement transition from mass protest to clandestine campaigns. I've called for a national commission to review what happened on January 6th, conduct impartial inquiries, and level hard criticism when warranted. The commission's purpose would not be to affix blame, but the reasons for the inadequacy of security must be examined and remedied. Our concern is not just protecting the Capitol. Most of you, I suspect, have been obliged to think more about your own security in recent days. Incessant threats to politicians, their staffs, and their families, vandals attacking the homes of congressional leaders, armed protesters barging into state houses, extremists plotting to kidnap a governor, now the violent invasion of the Capitol, are having a profound effect on public officials. The normalization of violence and threats affects their willingness to remain in office, and it could discourage others from entering public service. Tougher laws against incitement and communicating threats may be necessary, but how much control is possible while maintaining first right amendments? Many, including my fellow panel members here, are arguing for a domestic terrorism statute. Frankly, I have to say I'm a bit wary about this. A new statute should improve the chances of preventing attacks by facilitating intelligence collection and criminal investigations. I believe that can be addressed by adjustments in the Attorney General's guidelines combined with congressional oversight. What many mean by a new domestic terrorism statute is a domestic version of the material support provision of the Patriot Act, which criminalizes providing material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. Now, that requires designating domestic terrorist groups, and there's the problem. There are hundreds of extremist groups on both ends of the political spectrum, along with other issue-oriented groups that conceivably might be labeled terrorist organizations. Battle lines will be drawn as each party proposes its preferred list. The contentious debate could distract us from the problem, and it could end badly. My advice is to avoid the terrorism as much as possible and base prosecutions on existing criminal offenses, putting aside the political pretensions of the perpetrators. Mr. Katko mentioned that we are coming up to the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. For the past 20 years, homegrown jihadists have been a principal concern of authorities. Efforts to thwart their plots, fortunately, have been largely successful. I believe that shutting down domestic violent extremists may prove far more difficult. They are better organized than the homegrown jihadists, and recent actions have given them the opportunity to expand their networks. They are better armed. Some have military or police experience. Intelligence operations may operate in a less permissive environment, and programs aimed at preventing radicalization will provoke greater resistance. Let me conclude with a personal observation. Any realistic appreciation of the situation cannot ignore the current political environment. We, the people, elect you to represent our interests. Those interests are diverse and often conflicting. Addressing them requires calm discourse, thoughtful deliberation, and creative political compromise. How you conduct yourselves sets the tone. Whether it is one of divisive, bellicose rhetoric or instructive civil discourse, the choice is yours. Thank you.
I thank the witness for his testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for questions. Dr. Rodriguez, just for the sake of the committee's information, were you aware of the potential violence that might have occurred on January 6th? And if so, who did you notify of this information?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a great question. And we were, the Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency worked very closely with the Metropolitan Police Department and our federal partners to assess the threat environment prior to the January 6th insurrection. We did, and as I think all federal agencies that were sharing information with the city did indicate that there was the potential for violence, and that there was intelligence to suggest that there could be violence. And so that information was shared with the city. What it prompted us to do, Mr. Chairman, as the District of Columbia government, was to recommend to Mayor Bowser that we call up the National Guard. We did that on December 31st to help with traffic management and crowd control on city property. And so we also activated our Emergency Operations Center to ensure interagency coordination from the city standpoint prior to the protests that were expected on the 6th.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greenblatt, earlier before this committee, you talked about the importance of political leaders' rhetoric in combating anti-Semitism. Do you see that kind of rhetoric as a problem for what occurred on January 6th?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. There is no doubt that right-wing extremists have been encouraged to see their rhetoric repeated, to see their memes moved around by elected leaders at the highest levels. Again, when individuals, including the ex-president, would make statement likes after the melee in Charlottesville, where a woman was murdered, or a white supremacist rampaged through the town, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." when the prior president said that, quote, there are very fine people on both sides. Or again, when he would retweet out the rhetoric coming from white supremacists and use their language, like making claims about globalist conspiracy theories, or telling the Proud Boys in a debate that they should, quote, stand back or stand by. Or even after the melee, after the attack on the Capitol, suggesting that his supporters were, quote, very special people and that he loved them. When I say that this rhetoric emboldens them, I don't mean that rhetorically. I mean it literally, because at ADL, we track the extremists. We're monitoring them on Facebook and Twitter, but also on Signal and Telegram and the other platforms that they use. And they were saying, we feel emboldened to one another. The Proud Boys were saying, reporting for duty, sir. And again, we know that tens of thousands of people who showed up at the National Mall, look, the vast majority of them were ordinary individuals who had come to believe and been brainwashed to think that somehow the election wasn't legitimate, that somehow the votes had been stolen, despite the overwhelming and unambiguous evidence to the contrary. So there is no question, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the committee, there's nothing political in pushing back on prejudice, right? There is nothing partisan in adhering to a basic set of principles. And when leaders don't do that, it creates the space, if you will, that extremists can exploit and move from the margins into the mainstream. And I'll just make one last point. It isn't just about, again, the president of the United States. It could be the president of the local PTA, but people in positions of authority need to clearly and consistently call out disinformation, extremism, and hate, whether, again, it's coming from the president of the United States or a first-term member of Congress. Those who obsess about conspiracy theories, those who spread anti-Semitism and racism, they don't belong in the public conversation with a seat at the table. Period. End of story.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman for New York, Mr. Katko, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenblatt, I appreciate your comments, and I do think that the rhetoric has definitely led to what happened on January 6th, and I credit what you're saying. Is it's incumbent upon all of us to be mindful of what that rhetoric can do and what it did in this case. And that's why I voted for impeachment, because there's no question in my mind, as a Republican, I was the first to do so. And I did so because there's no question in my mind that the rhetoric inflamed it and turned the boiling water from a hot pot of water to overflowing. And that's what happened. There's just no question about it. So thank you for that. But I want to look at the issues more broadly, because that's what our job is. And, Ms. Newman, you mentioned that we need a domestic terror commission, if you will. What would you envision that looking like, and what would you think we should do from a legislative standpoint to form that commission, make sure it's effective?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. Look, as a former executive branch official, the day-to-day work that you have to do, the portfolios that counterterrorism professionals and law enforcement professionals have is enormous. You're often looking at urgent threats, at trying to make sure, especially in the heightened threat environment that we're in, that we're staying ahead of the threat actors. So my concern is that in this moment that we have really fantastic people that I trust, that I think are experts, that are coming into the Biden administration, that are going to treat this seriously. They're going to look at updating what they can from a policy perspective, or from even a cultural perspective. I think we need to explore how various institutional cultures may have contributed to missing this, or not taking the threat seriously enough. The honest truth is, this is extremely complex. As Mr. Jenkins pointed out, we really need to weigh the pros and cons of what, if we change the law, what are the unintentional consequences? There are many communities that have been historically hurt by laws that were passed to try to address terrorism. We need to treat that seriously and hear their concerns. It is not something that in your day-to-day work as a counterterrorism official, you have the time and the space to treat with the level of diligence it deserves. And that's why I think this is where you need a commission. You also need it out of, quite frankly, the political spotlight. The rhetoric I'm seeing on certain fairly prominent commentators that are painting with a very broad brushstroke. They, whoever they is, believe that 74 million Americans that voted for President Trump are domestic terrorists. Now, I'm an avid consumer of news, and I've been a news commentator of late. I haven't heard anybody saying that. It is not a prominent talking point in the mainstream, if you will, and yet we have just informed an echo chamber, and it continues to be repeated that that they are now painted as domestic terrorists. Well, unfortunately, that feeds the grievance cycle. That is likely to create more moving towards radicalization, potentially mobilizing to violence, because they've now been told that they're painted as domestic terrorists. So we have got to cut that off. We have got to cool the rhetoric happening on both sides. And part of the way to do that is to stand up a commission, bipartisan, that the people that are selected are trusted as being experts, honest brokers, and let them go off behind closed doors and debate this. And then let them bring it out to the public, to you, the Congress, who have the most important job of debating what the laws should be in our country. So I think you're looking for expertise in counterterrorism, law enforcement, civil liberties, and representatives from communities that have historically been on the receiving end of too much scrutiny or abuse by authorities. We need expertise from all of those to come and evaluate what the best path forward is here.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. And Mr. Jenkins, real briefly, two questions, and you can answer them briefly if you can. First of all, obviously, some of the far right violent extremists manifested itself on January 6th, but is it fair to say that violent extremism goes across the entire political spectrum from the far left to the far right, and that's something we need to keep in mind as we go forward here? That's number one. And number two is, if you want to add anything to what this commission should look like and what Ms. Newman said. Unmute yourself, please.
To the first question, you yourself pointed out that in the 60s and 70s, we were dealing with left-wing terrorists. In the 80s and 90s, it shifted back to the right. For the last 20 years, we've been looking at jihadist terrorists. And in recent years, right-wing terrorists has resurged again to be our principal problem. This moves over time, and I think we do have to address all dimensions of the threat coming from left and right. That's the nature of the kind of political violence we deal with in our country. In answer to the second part about the mission of the commission, I certainly agree with Ms. Newman that a bipartisan commission insulated from daily news and partisan politics can, number one, provide an accurate, thorough history of the events of January 6th. The 9/11 Commission's history of the 9/11 events is still the most accurate, thorough account, and that's useful. I think it can look at the intelligence issues, the security issues, not in the narrow sense, but in the broadest sense, about how we protect our government and its processes going forward in an age of the internet, and without turning really our public buildings, including the Capitol, into armed fortresses.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes other members for questions they may wish to ask witnesses. I recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority. Members are reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questioning, and to then mute themselves once they've finished speaking, and to leave their cameras on so they may be visible to the chair. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and to the ranking member as well, and to the witnesses. The attack on the Capitol was an act of domestic terrorism, and it was primarily and much attributed to the words of the President of the United States, who emboldened President Trump, who emboldened those who carried out this terrorist acts. I want to, first of all, acknowledge the loss of our beloved officer, Officer Sicknick, and other officers who have also lost their lives, but those who now continue to suffer with injuries, some of whom are still in hospitals. I believe it's our responsibility to find a solution and to do it in a bipartisan way. We need to do it as Americans. So I'm interested, Dr. Rodriguez, you indicated information coming from another number of sources. Would you tell me whether you, as DHS, know that you got information directly from FBI National? And did you convey that information to the Capitol Hill officers, police officers brass, the chief and others in your preparation? Dr. Rodriguez?
Thank you, Representative Jackson Lee. I appreciate the question. To the first part about getting information from the federal government or from the FBI, yes, we have good information sharing and intelligence sharing relationships with the Washington field office here in the district. And we were getting information from them about the potential for violence.
Did you convey that to the police on Capitol Hill?
I was just about to get to that. So we did convene, the Metropolitan Police Department and my office convened a variety of different phone calls and briefings with all relevant federal stakeholders, the Park Police and the Capitol Police, and all of our federal partners to make sure that everyone had the same intelligence and the same information.
Thank you so very much. And I support Mayor Bowser's need for control over the National Guard. Thank you so very much. Let me ask Ms. Newman about the idea of what's been represented is the number of witnesses, the number of individuals found to be affiliated with the United States military and law enforcement formerly, either active or retired. What would be your thoughts about the idea of stopping this tide of extremism in these particular organizations, overcoming the many excellent officers who stood the line for us, visibly fighting against domestic terrorists? How do we address that? And I'd like the witness, Mr. Jenkins, to answer that question as well. Thank you. Ms. Newman, and my time is short. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. Yes, can you hear me?
Very well.
Thank you for the question. I believe that though it might have shocked the American public, and there's been a lot of conversation about it, this has been a known challenge for decades. We know that white supremacist groups and militia groups target former military, former law enforcement for recruitment purposes upon their retirement. We also know that they encourage people when they're young, when they've been recruited into these movements, to stay clean so that they can enter into and not get caught through screening mechanisms that are in place so that they can get into the military, get into law enforcement. This is primarily because they're looking for people to have the training associated with being in the military and law enforcement. So your question was, what do we do about it? I do know that military and law enforcement cultures do have.
I have a short period of time, so I'll
Yes.
take your answer, and I'll just get Mr. Jenkins for a brief moment, because I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Greenback very quickly, and have a very short time, seconds. Mr. Jenkins, do you want to offer any comment?
Yes, no, the military can and over the years has repeatedly has to address the issue of political displays of political loyalties, of things that interfere with the unity of effort that is required in the military. They have experience in doing so, and they can do so. With regard to police departments, the major police departments have the ability to do this and are addressing it. But we have 17,000 police departments in this country, and to get some of the smaller police departments in various parts of the country to do this is a much bigger challenge.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, the symbols of racism, hatred for African Americans, hatred for people of the Jewish heritage and faith, why is that so strong in the white terrorists or domestic terrorism?
So there are different types of right-wing extremists, Congresswoman, but that you could bunch them into white supremacists and sort of anti-government types. But racism and anti-Semitism is at the beating heart of these movements. They believe there's a conspiracy controlled by Jews to use Black people to take over the white race. It is wrong. It is lunatic. But that's what we're dealing with, and unfortunately, it's far too prevalent.
Thank you so very much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana for 5 minutes, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say I'm humbled to return to the Homeland Security Committee and continue working to ensure the safety and security of our nation. I'd also like to welcome all the new members to the committee. This is an effective and functional and well-led committee. We seek nonpartisan solutions to challenges that face our country. It's an honor to resume my duties as a ranking member of the Board of Security Facilitation and Operations Subcommittee. There's still an abundance of work to be done to secure our nation, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in this committee to make that happen. The Biden administration has unfortunately begun implementing dangerous policies that threaten our homeland. The administration's proposal of amnesty for 11 million illegal immigrants will allow individuals who have knowingly committed the crime to receive the benefits and privileges that normally come with United States citizenship. This could be at the expense of hardworking Americans who are struggling due to the COVID-19 impact. This issue is further compounded by the Biden administration's executive order to end funding for the border wall. Reports from boots on the ground and crime statistics overwhelmingly show that physical barriers work. They deter and delay illegal crossings, which gives our border agents an advantage, and they need that over the illicit activities of drug cartels, gangs, and human traffickers. Those guys are outnumbered down there, and any delay in deterrence to the actual crossing gives them a chance to respond. Further, what's referred to as the Remain in Mexico policy, MPP, has been a critical tool in securing our southwest border. MPP ended the incentive of making fraudulent asylum claims and prevented migrants from disappearing into the United States. The end of that, catch and release is back. Reversing that policy allows our laws to be exploited. These Biden administration actions encourage illegal immigration. They reward it, and they will undoubtedly result in a surge of immigrants at the border, creating a new humanitarian crisis in the middle of a pandemic. Politically driven policies to reduce the footprint of Customs and Border Protection capabilities and resources at our southern border will also increase the number of immigrants who choose to take the dangerous illegal journey across our nation's bottom border. The administration's immigration policies are not safe for the American people or immigrants. Border security should not be as partisan of an issue as it has become. It never was before. We should all agree that we should secure our sovereign border. Together, we can work on making improvements to our immigration system while enforcing laws and providing security to our citizens. I'm pleased to continue the important duty of securing our homeland. I look forward to working with my colleagues moving forward. I thank the witnesses for being here today. The topic of domestic terrorism should continue to be addressed aggressively through this committee. None of us condone any type of violent protest, while at the same time we support a citizen's right to have his grievances heard through his First Amendment protections to assemble and to redress those grievances. So we must seek the balance of aggressively prosecuting domestic terror where it's truly uncovered after a thorough investigation and due process has been served, and at the same time maintain our core principles of protection of First Amendment rights and freedoms across the country. Mr. Chairman, I especially appreciate your leadership. You have been a solid and fair and incredibly even-handed gentleman. through the course of my service. I look forward to working with my colleague and friend, Representative Katko, as the ranking member. God bless us one and all. We have work to do, and I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to congratulate you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for getting this hearing together. Very timely and important hearing, but most especially, I want to congratulate you on once again taking the helm, the gavel as our chairman. Look forward to continue to work with you, and I want to congratulate also Mr. Katko on his new role as the ranking member of the full committee. I have found Mr. Katko to be one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. I've enjoyed working with you, Mr. Katko, on a number of issues, particularly around cyber, and I especially appreciate your leadership on that topic. So with that, thank you. I just wanted to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for your input and your insights today, and helping us and guiding us as we go forward to get our arms around the challenges we face around domestic terrorism and the undermining of our democracy. This is a long-term challenge that we are going to have to confront, and we have to get this right for the good of our country. One of the most corrosive things I see out there, and that we have to contend with, is the disinformation, misinformation campaigns that are out there, and that continue to have this terrible corrosive nature. Ms. Newman, I wanted to start with you asking what tools and metrics does the Department of Homeland Security have in place for measuring the prevalence of corrosive disinformation, misinformation in circulation? And also, Ms. Newman, I wanted to ask, in your written testimony, you highlight that the starting point for many extremists is a vulnerable population who may be frustrated or angry and are susceptible to messages of blame and grievance. You list countermeasures, including community-based resilience and direct counter messaging. What agencies or organizations are in place to implement these countermeasures, and what more can we be doing? But if you can start with the misinformation, disinformation.
Thank you for the question. Yes, sir, and thank you for the question. On the disinformation, at DHS, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, largely has taken the lead around disinformation, in particular because of election security. But I believe they appreciated that there is much to disinformation that expands far beyond the elections. In particular, we noted when the pandemic was starting back in March, we saw early signs of disinformation and misinformation. And my former staff actually predicted that we were likely to see violence related to that, and sadly that became true. You asked, though, how we measure it, and I don't know that I have a good answer. During my tenure, it was certainly more qualitative, not necessarily quantitative. But it has been a year since I was at the department, so they may have made some advances. Certainly, they were able to tell me whether there had been an increase or a decrease, or if the nature or origin of it had shifted. But I don't know that we have solid metrics. That would be a good question to ask the department. On the nature of the vulnerable individuals and what do we do, that is where the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention is doing work around innovation and research. You all provided grant funds this last year to increase to 20 million. And those funds, in part, are going to research some of these issues. There are also some private industry or private sector efforts. The CVE, Moonshot CVE comes to mind, where they're looking at when people search for certain terms, if they are offered kind of an alternative perspective. Does that messaging work? Does that move people away from maybe the disinformation that they were seeking? So there are any number of efforts, including one that I think is fairly promising, a peer-to-peer exchange where college students are, as part of a class in communications, develop campaigns to basically counter disinformation, and win. The winning, usually it's done in a contest style, the winning campaign gets used, paid for to be used more broadly in their community. I think innovation is really important here. Disinformation, of course, has been around for decades, but the viral nature of it through technology makes the challenge very hard.
Okay, do you think that DHS is the agency that should be leading this counter messaging resilience within the U.S. government? Yes or no?
It's certainly yes, in strong partnership with other agencies that have expertise.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know my time is expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes gentleman from North Carolina for 5 minutes, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Newman, you're familiar with the security profile around Lafayette Square and the events of last June where St. John Church was burned somewhat, and then there was a big controversy over the security cordon that was sort of established thereafter, right? You're familiar with that? Ms. Newman,
I am familiar. I was a private citizen at the time.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I can. I was a private citizen at the time, but I am familiar with the public accounts.
And do you spend time in Washington even now, I assume, right? Ms. Newman, were you able to hear me?
Yes, I live in the area.
Have you been in the Lafayette Park area since then and seen the fencing and so forth that's in that area?
Yes, I live in.
And it's also true that since last summer, there's been much of the downtown
Yes,
has
sir.
been boarded up and so forth, correct? Ma'am, there are a lot of the storefronts and so
Yes,
forth
sir.
down there that have been continuously boarded up, right? And so you've also said in your paper that